Hello again. My name is Brian Geary. I'm the Communications Director at Pearson College, UWC. And today my guest is Nosa Ero-Brown. She's a year 1994 alumni, originally from Nigeria. Nosa is in Toronto right now, and she is the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Antiracism Directorate for the province of Ontario. And let me back up a second and just remind everyone that I'm speaking from the Wasanic and Algonquin speaking people's territory. And of course, the Pearson campus is on the traditional territory of the Chianu Nation. Nosa, I'd put that a bit backwards, but please, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Brian. It's nice to meet you. And I'm joining you from the city of Toronto, which is also the original territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit and many First Nations. And I am so pleased to be here as a refugee immigrant, a previous student from Pearson College as well. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for that. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And I know every conversation these days starts with COVID, but how are your family coping with COVID? I know that certain regions in Ontario, when we recorded this interview, are still under pretty severe restrictions.
Yes, thanks, Brian, for asking. Of course, the pandemic has affected everyone, but as somebody who's much wiser than me said, we are all in the same storm, but we are all in very different boats. And having said that, Ontario is on a lockdown right now. We are lucky that we can work from home, but there's so many of us that are still, frontline essential workers and still having to go out. And it's been a challenge for the COVID numbers here, but everyone is doing their best given the situation.
Absolutely. And fingers crossed on this beautiful day, both here in Victoria and in Toronto, that COVID is going to be flattening as well. Can we talk a little bit about your role as the ADM, the Assistant Deputy Minister in the Anti-Racism Directorate? I don't know if Ontario is the only jurisdiction in Canada that has such a body, but maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit.
No, for sure. There are similar organizations around Canada, that notably the federal government has an anti-racism secretariat as well. But the Ontario Antiracism Directorate is really the first of its kind. We also have we're one of the first ones to have a very solid anti-racism policy. The Directorate has a mandate to eliminate systemic racism in government policies, decisions, programs, and really to advance racial equity in Ontario for Indigenous, Black, and racialized populations. Mm-hmm. We also have the carriage of the anti-racism policy for the Ontario Public Service. And mm-hmm. I believe it's one of the largest employers in Canada. We have almost 70,000 staff. So we have the carriage for the anti-racism policy for the public service and also the broader public sector in Ontario.
The scope sounds fairly government oriented. Does your reach extend into the private sector or other sectors other than the public service?
So it depends how we define reach. We do a lot of collaborations, but really the mandate is very government specific. It's in government policies mm-hmm. and practices. We do a lot of partnerships with private sector and community groups, of course, and not-for-profit sector, but the mandate is focused on government.
Well, thank you for anticipating my next question, because I was going to ask, how do you manufacture or influence change in sort of the wider societies? So it's through partnerships, so it's through tools such as education, right. I would imagine as well.
Exactly. So interesting. When we had the first, we are operating a current strategy, a 5-year strategy right now. And one of the key tools in there was really foundational to all of this, based on extensive research and feedback, is really the need to collect race-based data, disaggregated data. And we have anti-racism legislation, which is one of the tools at our disposal mm-hmm. that enables us to regulate certain sectors. And we've chosen to focus on 3 key sectors: so child welfare, education, and health. In all of this, we also try to provide tools that would really enable us to move the agenda forward. So in addition to race-based data collection, we have an anti-racism impact assessment, which is really a lens through which you develop policies and strategies. And we also have extensive capacity building, so anti-racism competencies. We've developed a robust one for the public service, where all of our senior leaders were put through that competency training the past year or so. And we're seeing that as well in other public sector organizations. So those are some of the tools that we have and levers that we apply.
The three sectors you mentioned earlier are incredibly broad and wide-ranging, but I imagine that they were chosen in terms of the influence that they have because they are so broad. Health sector, education, child welfare.
That's right, and justice, I should add. So yes, they were chosen because of that, but also because those are the sectors that you would typically see overrepresentation in incarceration, for example, in the justice sector, the dropout rates in education, overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black children in the child welfare sector. And this was based on a lot of research and community engagement, et cetera. And health is an area now that we are, because of the pandemic and even before that, seeing a lot of inequity and the social determinants of health, like housing and education, et cetera, that need to be addressed. But health equity is something that's also emerging as a priority for us as well. So,
tell us a little bit about the challenges and the successes in your role. I believe you've been in place in the ADM spot since the beginning of 2020.
Yes, so I joined the Antiracism Directorate last year. So it's been almost a year in the role, but I've been an assistant deputy minister for longer in other sectors. So I was in transformation, open government, treasury board, and I've had most of my career in government. But let me first acknowledge, before addressing your comment about challenges and successes, that there are so many strong leaders, role models, fighters, my ancestors in Nigeria that have come before me, that have faced so many challenges in this fight for racial equity and social justice, that really whenever I hear that about challenges, and I always go, what I am facing is nothing, absolutely nothing compared to those people who have done this and fought for so long, right? So putting that in context, any challenges that I'm facing or the directorate is facing in this current role pales in comparison. Having said that, though, within my own current context of working in the public sector, I think one thing that I have found doing this work and being on the forefront of it is, first of all, you have to know what the problem is to try to solve it or address it. An agreement and acknowledgement of what the issue is, because of our political environment that's been so divided, in that things that we hold as truths have now become things that we debate, just the humanity of people, right? Shouldn't be up for debate, but you wonder sometimes, right? And having seen how charged the conversations around systemic racism can be, although there's ample data and evidence on the consequences of systemic racism, one of those key challenges is really that agreement and acknowledgement of systemic racism. It's amazing where, how you still hear a number of organizations, people still say there's nothing to see here. And so it's really hard to face the issue when we don't all agree that there is something to see here. Right. So that I find, a challenge. And of course, as with any change and behavioral change, our status quo as human beings is to stay the same. So people have a vested interest in maintaining that status quo for a variety of reasons. And there are a lot of different ways that people have tried to change this, but that's also a very sticky challenge, right? Like, how do we get at the behavior we want to see?
Exactly, and getting to the nub of defining the problem and getting agreement on the problem, as you point out, these days seems to be one of the biggest challenges across the board.
Yes.
So kudos very much to you and the director for doing that. Now, I sort of want to go back, and I'm doing this backwards, but I want to go back in your career and sort of your trajectory after
Mhm.
leaving Pearson. You've worked in government for most of your career. You've had an interest in open government, open data
Yes.
sources.
Mhm.
Um, and forgive me if I'm reading too much into this, but you view government as an active advocate for diversity, the obligation to
Mhm.
support rights and justice.
Yeah.
Is that partly why you were drawn to public service? Is that a guiding light?
So yeah, thanks, Brian. That's an interesting question. And when I get asked about this, I often think back to where I started. Both my parents were public servants, so that was a big influence. My dad, worked in the forestry department. He was a civil servant. My mom was a teacher. So I've always believed in service.
Mhm.
And that's been, for my Nigerian parents, they drilled that into you. You need to be useful to somebody other than yourself. And so that was a value growing up. But my Pearson College education also played a huge role in that. Equity, justice, and just the desire to see a better world. And it can be overwhelming when you look at the world and when we're, idealistic and trying to let's just do that. But it's really going back and trying to be that change and looking at my
Mhm.
own sphere of influence. And I love policy, I love process. I just, I like being able to work with people towards a common solution. And those were natural sort of skill sets to work in government. So I found myself here, right? And I love it. I actually really do. I think there is a lot of room for the government to be able to make change. I think there is a lot of opportunity for innovation to do things differently.
Mhm.
And having grown up in a place where I grew up under a military dictatorship for most of my young life, being able to have government that listens, or at least even the semblance of listening, where you could disagree with policy issues and topics and matters, and not have your life threatened. I think that is such a gift that I wanted to be a part of.
Unfortunately, it's not a gift that much of the world actually has, isn't it?
Exactly.
And to work within a government structure that is actually responsive
Exactly.
to what people are saying and the needs of individuals, I guess, and groups.
Mhm.
So let's go back then even further to your
Right.
Pearson years and tell me a little bit about your Pearson experience. How did you learn about UWC originally? What kind of a learning did you have, or what kind of a journey did you have from hearing about UWC to
Right.
arriving on campus with, I read somewhere, $10 US in your pocket?
Yes. So I love telling the story because it's just every time I think about it, it's amazing. It's actually really incredible. So I was in the boarding school in Nigeria. I actually went to a military boarding school, believe it or not, in Nigeria. So I was 15, I think, or 16 at the time, and we were allowed visiting days. So like every first Saturday of the month, your parents could come, and my mom came with this little cutout for the newspaper, the ad for the UWC, and she said, "Oh, I saw this, and I thought you'd be interested in applying because she knew I loved to read and I always dreamt of traveling, even though I never left Nigeria." So she said, apply for it, and maybe when I come visit you next time, I'll pick up the application. So I did, and I just thought, oh, this is interesting. And lo and behold, I got called for an interview and to figure out how to get to Lagos, which
Mhm.
was the capital at that time, and got through the interview process. And lo and behold, I got selected. It was just like, it was quite interesting, the entire experience. And I remember even like my mom was excited, but at the same time, she was worried because we couldn't even afford the plane ticket.
Of
We
course.
had to, rely on friends and the generosity of family to get me to Pearson College. And even my journey to get to the college, I arrived at Lester B. Pearson Airport, and I thought I had arrived at the college. And I called the college to come pick me up, and they were like, "Nope, you need another flight."
One more long
So
flight.
yeah, one more, a couple more actually, and then you'll be
Yeah.
here. But that it was amazing for, a young Black kid from Nigeria with just sort of, just wide-eyed and the world at, ready to help. It was such an amazing experience. And, having roommates that I had never met, someone who was Japanese, I'd never met someone from Nunavut or Indonesia.
Mm-hmm.
And those were my roommates. So I wrote a lot of letters. I did a lot of, thinking during that first year. It was a beautiful experience.
Well, tell us very briefly about your 2-year experience at Pearson, living in a new environment, living with roommates from around the world, as you say. Was it a bit of a culture shock? And tell us about the good and the bad in 20 seconds or less.
Of course, it was a culture shock. Like I think for many of us, it was. And, speaking from my perspective and vantage point as a, African in Nigeria, it was especially a culture shock because the differences in, all the other communities and Canadian culture, even calling your teacher by name is not something that I was used to. Or having, somebody who identifies as male sort of in my personal space, kissing me on my cheek. It was just like, oh my goodness. Like it was a lot to absorb there, but it was also good learning. But also, I think, coming of age there in a place where you're not guided by the culture where you sort of grown up and identified with. I did struggle a lot with that. It was the first place that, I learned what it was to be Black and what it meant to be Black. I struggled with identifying on forms as Black because I never identified as Black. I identified as Nigerian or from Benin. And, learning about what that meant and learning about the legacy of being Black and the connotations that could come with that, the legacy of slavery, whereas, my sort of orientation was around colonialism, but it was sort of like two sides of a similar coin. So those things were hard, and I'm glad that I had friends that sort of understood those experiences and it helped me to navigate those kinds of issues. And there were also issues of equity. I remember, I was wearing a sweater that was sort of a hand-me-down from somebody because obviously I came with clothes from a temperate region. And he said, "Oh, you're wearing my sweater." And I, my 16-year-old self just wanted to melt into the ground because it's like, why would you ever, give me a sweater for somebody that is on campus? And that still sticks in my memory. And it's not a big deal, but to teenagers, it is a
big deal.
It's a big deal. Yeah. So, those kinds of things, they're, and I wouldn't say I think they're all experiences that propel you and make you stronger. So I tend not to say this is good, this is bad. All experiences are learning, right? They were learning, they made me stronger. They have given me the perspective to get where I am. So I can't say it was good and I can't say it was bad. It was just a good learning experience.
It informed your learnings and it informed your experience to this moment now.
Absolutely.
Well. I always ask this question of alumni that I interview. Was there any individual, and you can name names if you like, but was there any individual, a teacher, a fellow student, anyone on campus who made an oversized impression upon you while you were at Pearson, like an incredible memory?
Oh, it's always a really tough question because there were very, very many. But I had a math teacher. His name is Augustine Rusi. I believe he's still in the West Coast anyway. Yes. He was just, I think he was the right person at the right time. He was my only teacher that was of African descent. And there were times when I struggled that he could see, he just helped me find my voice. And to this day, I can never thank him enough for seeing what others couldn't see, because there are cultural differences that I was very shy. I would never speak up, but he would tease it out and coax it out and made sure that my voice was heard. And it was really hard when I was leaving campus because he was not only my math teacher. At that point, he was just like a pseudo parent to me. So made such an impression.
I've only met Rusi a couple of times, very, very briefly, but he's still very interested in the UWC world.
Yes.
And
yes.
so we appreciate that. I know the time is running out and you've got a bit of a hard stop in a few minutes, but I guess I wanted to ask, did your Pearson education have a wider impact on what you do today and how you do it? And if so, how so?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I don't think I'll be where I am today without Pearson, actually. And in a lot of ways, this may sound, kind of corny, but Lester B. Pearson's words, I can never forget. And I still I still use it as my guiding principle about, having peace through understanding of people, right? And it's still, it guides me. It's my sort of North Star, if you will. And I have taken that through my university, my career, and all of that, in that at the core of it, we're just people wanting to learn, wanting to know that we are seen, heard, and that's what it is. When the walls come down and you understand and see the humanity of the other person, things become less complex than we make it. And Pearson College really had a role to play in that, because we ended up living that ideal on campus, right? With our fellow students, learning together and, having this really protected bubble for 2 years. But then breaking out of that bubble, I kept that with me. And I have 2 children now, and I keep saying that, and they will tell you that Lester B. Pearson quote in a minute, because I drill it down on them, and it's like, you really have to make the time to know each other. Then you understand where people are coming from, and your perspective is not the only perspective.
Well, it's good to know. Thank you for reminding us of some of the key quotes that Lester B. Pearson made, which influenced the philosophy of the college. We're coming up on 50 years in a few years, and Pearson itself was formed in a Cold War atmosphere, and a lot has happened since then. So sometimes it's nice to go back to that type of a foundation and understand what motivated people and influenced people. I have an extremely long preamble to my next question. I'm not going to go through all of it. And I apologize in advance, because sometimes it seems like I'm asking people to do the heavy lifting. But we at Pearson have been a part of multiculturalism, internationalism for a long time. But the point has been made, and very strongly, mainly from our students, is that bringing people together is only one thing. You have to have conversations that are difficult, that are happy, that are joyful, that are challenging. We've had a long-standing relationship with our neighbors on the Chicano First Nation community, and we've only recently, I think, in the past year, sort of taken that to a further relationship, I guess, more than just neighbors and living on the unceded territory. And we're actually working with them as genuine partners. In fact, we're just on the verge of incorporating a number of Sinchotan language names to our areas with the permission from the Chicano First Nation. So what advice would you share with our students, with our college leaders, about how we can authentically and honestly progress on big, complex, and essential matters of race, of justice?
Yeah. So I think that's a really important question. And I would agree. It's not enough to bring people together. And I'm saying that too, even in a work setting, when we have the bringing people together, it's diversity, and that's it. And then we went from that to inclusion, right? but it's really taking the proactive approach to remove the barriers, right, that are in place for those people thriving and progressing and really participating fully. So it's not enough to bring them to the table or bring them to the school, but how are we equipping our students, and how are we equipping our in my case, my coworkers, to be able to survive and thrive. So I'm actually really pleased that, to see that Pearson College is, recommitting to Indigenous reconciliation and decolonization, and is rights-based and solution focused, and comes from a place of strength and from the heart. I think, there are so many things that we could do in terms of advice, but if I were to leave you with one thing, there is a lot of talk around this right now. And I see this in the media, I see this with corporations, and there's the pledge and all of that. And my own personal worry is the place that is coming from, in that we need to be seen to be doing something and checking a box versus actually doing the work,
right,
and doing the hard work. And part of doing that hard work is listening to the voices of Indigenous, Black, racialized students who should be at the center of these initiatives. They say nothing for us without us. It starts with really listening, truly listening, and starting from that position for what needs to be done, rather than rushing to, like, we're doing the training, we're doing this, and those things are great. But if we're tackling systemic racism, which to me is really important, I think we really need to be looking at removing those systemic barriers that got people vulnerable in the first place, right? Rather than fixing it after the fact.
Well, thank you. I hope that we can live up to those inspiring words and continue to progress, I guess, on the path that we've been walking down for some time. It's a hard stop. I know you have to go, Nosa. Is there anything that we've missed? Anything else I'd like to add?
No, just thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. I'm a proud member of the UWC family, and proud of the opportunity that's in Pearson College. And I send my love to everyone at the college.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time with us. And I hope you have a chance to go out and enjoy the beautiful weekend that's coming.
You too. Thanks,
Thank
Brian.
you.
Okay.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye.